Hello, and welcome to the world of Pokemon. My name is Professor Noki, and you're here once again for another lesson of Pok-education on Noki Jr. Today, we will be tackling the question of what are Pokemon type weaknesses and resistances. As those of you who have played most of the Pokemon games know, and even those who have watched the anime are well aware of, Pokemon have certain type weaknesses and even certain resistances from different typings during battle as well. First of all, in order to discuss what the Pokemon's weaknesses and resistances might be, we first have to establish what the different Pokemon types are. Now, I've broken these different types down to 3 different categories. There are the elemental types: fire, water, grass, electric, ice, rock, and ground. The living types being the flying, fighting, bug, normal, poison, and steel types, and the ethereal types, which include ghost, psychic, dark, fairy, and dragon. As I broke down in an earlier Pok-education lesson covering what are Pokemon, I established where these differing types came from and how they correspond to the differing things in our own real world. And moving on to the discussion regarding a Pokemon's weaknesses, this very much corresponds here as well. There are, of course, the very obvious type weaknesses like fire's weakness to water, water's weakness to grass, and grass's weakness to fire. These are very obviously plays of the real world where fire can be put out by water, water essentially helps grass grow, and overall, grass doesn't do very kindly to fire. However, there are a number of type weaknesses that are a little bit more subtle in their comparison to the real world counterparts. One such instance of this being steel type Pokemon's weakness to fire type moves, being a subtle nod to how steel can be forged with enough heat applied to it. There's also the fact that psychic type moves are generally massively effective against living creature type Pokemon. However, in reverse, psychic-type Pokemon are extremely weak against ghost-type Pokemon, maybe being in reference to the whole seance or the people that are trying to draw spirits and get overtaken by them in the psychic world. Ice is good against flying, obviously a subtle nod to the fact that when birds fly too high and get too much ice on their wings, it would make them drop altitude and possibly crash to the ground. And there are plenty more examples of how the real-world counterpart of these Pokemon typings plays into the overall weaknesses that the Pokemon will have. Now, adversely, a Pokemon's resistances are a lot more complicated and aren't as cut and dry as to how they represent and compare to the real world. One such interesting example comes from the Fire-type Pokemon, which obviously resist fire and grass, and ice and bug, but also fairy. Now, maybe this has to do with the fact that fairies are generally the keepers of forests and nature, so they would see fire as a bad thing. However, it is very interesting to me that the fire-type Pokemon have a lot more resistances than the other typings of water and even grass, which each only have 4. Water resists fire, water, ice, and steel, and grass resists water, electric, grass, and ground. Now, I will say that most of these do still make sense overall and correspond to the Pokemon's weaknesses. However, there are a few quirks among the Pokemon's resistances that are very interesting to me and how the Pokemon Company has weaved them in perfectly among the balance of the battling system. And in my opinion, a very interesting point to note is that Steel-type Pokemon actually have the most resistances of all other typings, with a whopping 10 resistances, including normal, grass, ice, flying, psychic, bug, rock, dragon, steel, and fairy, which is just an incredible amount of resistances for any Pokemon to carry. But then when you include the fact that some Pokemon can be dual typing, and you add it to Pokemon that have resistances that the Steel-type Pokemon don't carry, then you have one incredibly resistant Pokemon. For instance, a Dark and Steel-type Pokemon would also include the resistances to both Dark and Ghost-type Pokemon, which would make it only vulnerable to just a few typings. And this is why it's extremely important as a Pokemon trainer to work towards familiarizing yourself with the differing weaknesses and resistances that different Pokemon can have. Obviously, it probably isn't very likely that you'll memorize every single one of these. However, if you start to familiarize yourself over time, you'll gain a lot more confidence in battle when you're choosing which moves or even which Pokemon to send out. And it really doesn't hurt to actually carry one of these nifty charts along with you. Either download one onto your mobile device or print one off if you're playing at home. It can be very helpful when you're stuck in a bind and you can't quite remember which Pokemon are strong or weak against each other. And thus concludes another lesson in Pok-education. I thoroughly hope this answered the question of what are Pokemon type weaknesses and resistances. And I hope to see you all on Sunday for the News with Noki, where I have a load of amazing information coming out from Pokemon Sword and Shield, Star Wars, and Marvel. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, this has been Professor Noki, signing out once again for Noki Jr.